Kyle was leaning on my desk when I arrived Thursday morning, wearing the expression he reserves for news he's already decided I should take badly. "Dominic Hale is back," he said. No preamble. No "hey, how was your commute?" Just 4 words, delivered with the studied care of a man dropping a live grenade and stepping back to watch. I set my bag down. Picked up the coffee he'd left on my desk, which I hadn't asked for, which meant he wanted something. Outside the window the city was doing its November thing, gray, damp, indifferent. The kind of morning that doesn't owe you anything. "Saw him going into the Meridian building yesterday," Kyle continued. "Suits like that don't arrive for brunch." He paused, tilting his head with the casualness of a man who has rehearsed this. "Look, Paul, you're a good guy. You know that. But you also have to admit, between you and Dominic Hale, she had a type before you came along and you are not that type." He lowered his voice like he was doing me a favor. "Stepping back now would be the dignified move. You're outclassed, man. No shame in knowing it." He was waiting for the slow nod. The self-deprecating exhale. The "yeah, you're probably right." I took a sip of coffee. Said nothing. He took my silence as agreement. He was wrong. My name is Paul Atreides. I am 34 years old and I run operations for Callaway & Partners, which is a mid-sized logistics company that nobody outside commercial freight has ever heard of, and I made my peace with that a long time ago. My job is the art of invisible coordination, making sure 1,200 units of someone else's product arrive in the correct city, at the correct temperature, on the correct truck, without anyone upstairs having to think about how it happened. When I do my job well, nobody notices. I have considered this fact for years and decided it suits me fine. I was married once before. Her name was Claire. We lasted 4 years, which was long enough to build something comfortable and not quite enough to figure out that comfortable was not the same as chosen. There was no catastrophe, no infidelity, no single breaking point to carry around, just the long, slow erosion of the thing we'd originally been reaching toward. We divided the apartment, the savings, and the book collection with the same methodical calm that had probably been the problem all along. I signed the papers on a Tuesday in October, drove home in the dark, made pasta from scratch because I needed something to do with my hands, and sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight. Not shattered. Not bitter even. Just finally honest with myself about the shape of the thing. I bought a house in Morningfield 18 months later. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced east, a backyard that required more attention than it received. I collected books faster than I read them. History, natural science, fiction, the occasional celebrity memoir I claimed was a joke but always finished. I subscribed to one podcast about the history of cartography, and listened to it on Sunday mornings while doing laundry because I am exactly that person and have stopped apologizing for it. 3 close friends. Good coffee made carefully. Bed before 11. I had arrived at a particular kind of stillness, not emptiness, stillness. The quiet specific to a person who has assessed his life, made the necessary adjustments and genuinely accepted the result. I was not waiting for anything to change. I was not aware that Diana Chin had different plans. The Callaway merger had been developing for 6 months before it produced the meeting that produced Diana. The conference room on the 14th floor of the Meridian building was designed to impress people who were already impressed with themselves. Floor-to-ceiling glass, leather chairs in a shade of gray that probably had a name like Executive Shadow or Slate Intention. A view of Lake Michigan on days when the fog cooperated. It was mid-March, which meant the fog did not cooperate. The city beyond the glass was a smear of white and charcoal, the heating was overworking itself, and someone had ordered coffee that had been sitting on the sideboard long enough to develop opinions. The room smelled of new carpet and old ambition. 18 people sat around a table that could have accommodated 25, spread out with the instinctive territoriality of people uncertain whether they trusted each other. I was there because Callaway was acquiring a distribution subsidiary of Chin Meridian Tech, Diana's company, and my role was to understand the logistic structure we'd be absorbing. I had a legal pad, 2 pens, and zero interest in the 20-minute debate about whether the quarterly handshake clause required an additional subpoint. I was on my 3rd doodle of a filing system that would have solved everything in 7 minutes when the side door opened. She arrived 17 minutes late. Not breathless. Not apologetic. She came through the door with the composed, unhurried energy of someone who had calculated exactly how late she could be and arrived at the precise moment she'd chosen. She set her laptop at the head of the table with the specificity of a person who had sat at enough heads of tables to stop finding it interesting. She did not introduce herself. She looked at the room once, the way you look at a chessboard after your opponent's first move, taking inventory, and then she opened her laptop and said, "All right. Where are we?" Not a question. An assessment. She was 38. I learned that later. At the time I registered only, efficient, contained, leaving no gap for anyone else to fill. Her hair was pinned back with the carelessness of someone who had done it in the car and had not thought about it since. Her jacket was charcoal, good fabric, no flourish. She had the kind of posture that didn't come from a yoga class but from having stood at the front of too many rooms for too long. Physical description came later, when I had stopped trying to categorize her professionally and found I couldn't help noticing anyway. Her eyes were gray-green, a specific, unusual shade like sea glass found somewhere northern and cold, and they were sharp in a way the rest of her face wasn't, because the rest of her face carried the particular tiredness of an executive who actually works, which is not the same as worn out. It was the tiredness of someone who has been paying attention for years without stopping. She noticed everything. She was not especially interested in whether you knew it. The one detail I fixed on, and could not explain, could not shake, was this. When the Callaway attorney made a point she found uninteresting, she uncapped her pen and wrote one single word in the margin of her notepad. Just one. Later, when I walked past her end of the table after the meeting broke, I saw it. Patience. Written to herself. A reminder, not a note. I thought about that more than I should have on the drive home. She had a daughter. 6 years old, named Vivian, who went by Vivi and had apparently developed, somewhere around age 4, the firm conviction that the color purple was non-negotiable for cup selection. I learned these 3 weeks into the acquisition process. It was the first time Diana Chin smiled in front of me, full, unguarded, gone before I could catalog it, and it was the first time I thought, this is a more complicated person than the room has been allowed to see. That was when things began to complicate for me too. The contract marriage was Diana's attorney's idea, and I want to establish that clearly so nobody thinks either of us was desperate. Chin Meridian was in the middle of a board restructuring. Diana's father, who had founded the company 40 years ago, had built a controlling interest clause into his estate requiring the majority shareholder, Diana, to be married by her 39th birthday or cede 40% of her stake to a board vote. It was exactly the kind of archaic, patriarchal document that should have been contested in court, and probably could have been, but the legal fight would have taken 2 years and cost more in distraction than the stake was worth. Diana's attorney, a careful woman named Sasha who clearly found the whole situation distasteful but had been paid to treat it professionally, had run the numbers. A marriage of convenience to a low-profile, financially stable individual, someone with no public profile, no agenda, and no claim to the company, was, mathematically, the cleaner solution. I was referred through Patrick, a college friend who did contract law for Meridian. He called me in February, explained the situation with the calm professionalism of a man who understood this was strange but had been paid to treat it as normal, and asked whether I'd be willing to have dinner with Diana to discuss it. I said yes. I've thought about why more since than I did at the time. The dinner was at a private room in a restaurant called Archer's, which was the kind of place where the menu had no prices and the lighting was so flattering it felt dishonest. Diana arrived exactly on time. She ordered sparkling water and made no small talk, and within 4 minutes she had placed a single sheet of paper in front of me, a preliminary terms outline, and said, "Read it. Ask whatever you need. I'll answer honestly." She did. She answered every question without deflection, including the ones I'd expected to make her uncomfortable. What her daughter's involvement in the arrangement would be, what the exit clause looked like, what happened if either of us developed complications. She paused on that last word. Just one beat. Complications, she said, are managed, not eliminated. We shook hands. I signed the preliminary agreement 3 days later. The dinner that formalized everything came 2 weeks after that. 8 people around the long table in the Meridian conference room, lawyers and directors and 2 of Diana's senior partners, and me in the suit I'd worn to my sister's wedding 5 years ago and hadn't had cause to wear since. The room was professionally cordial and had the specific chill of people assessing something they weren't sure what to make of. Kyle, who had somehow managed to get himself included as my support, sat to my left and had been making small, pointed comments since we arrived. About the room, about the terms, about the general improbability of the arrangement. He was building toward something. I could tell by the way he kept glancing at Diana. Gerald Mack sat at the far end of the table. 60-something. The kind of man who had never questioned whether a room belonged to him. He'd been skeptical of the arrangement from the start, and his skepticism had the specific flavor of a man who found Diana's independence professionally impressive and personally inconvenient. He'd been quiet for most of the dinner. Then the terms had been reviewed and the lawyers had put down their pens, and Gerald leaned back in his chair and made his assessment, looking not quite at Diana, not quite at me, but at the space between us, in the way people do when they want to say something without technically saying it to a person. I suppose for a woman in Diana's position, he said, this is the most practical option available. He gestured vaguely with one hand. Not many men would want to take on the full picture. The full picture. A 38-year-old divorcee. A daughter. A company that consumed her completely. A woman who arrived to meetings with patience written to herself in the margins and left no room for anyone else's expectations. Kyle made a sound beside me. A short, agreeable hum. He was looking at me, waiting for the nod, the knowing exhale, the camaraderie of two men understanding each other. The table waited. I looked at Gerald Mack for a long moment. Then I looked at Diana, who had gone very still, her hand flat on the table, her jaw set in the specific way of someone who has had this reaction many times and has become very practiced at containing it. I said, quietly and specifically, I think the word you're looking for is fortunate. Nobody laughed. Nobody was meant to. I held Gerald's gaze for exactly long enough to be clear about what I meant, then I turned back to the contract documents as though I had said nothing interesting at all. Kyle stared at me. I didn't look at him. Underneath the table, Diana's hand, the one that had been pressed flat, moved. Not toward me. Just open. Released. Like something that had been held had let go. I noted it. Said nothing about it. But something had shifted in the room. Not romantically, I told myself that firmly and mostly believed it. Something had just shifted. We had agreed practically on shared space. Her condo was larger, better located, and contained a child already enrolled in a school 3 blocks away, so I moved in. I kept a box of books in the guest room, which became books in the study, which became, over 3 weeks of gradual displacement, books on the shelves in the hall, because the guest room had quietly evolved into something else and neither of us had discussed it. My French press appeared on her counter. Her espresso machine stayed. We operated with the courtesy of two people sharing a transit platform, aware of each other, not in each other's way. The first real moment happened in week 4. I was making coffee at 6:15 a.m. because I always make coffee at 6:15 a.m., and Diana came into the kitchen in her work clothes and looked at the French press and said, "That smells like an accusation." "It's a medium roast," I said. "Completely reasonable. I've been running on espresso since 2019. She crossed her arms. Reasonable coffee is an insult to my nervous system. But she poured herself a cup. Stood at the counter drinking it with the focused attention of a woman looking for the catch. Tilted her head. Don't say it," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say it's better than you expected." She looked at me over the rim. "I was going to say it's better than it has any right to be, given the equipment." She set the cup down. "But yes." I went back to my laptop. She left for work. She took a cup to go every morning after that. Neither of us mentioned it. The second moment was Vivi. Vivian Chin was 6 years old, 4 feet tall, and had developed, somewhere around age 4, the absolute conviction that all adult decisions were subject to her review. She had dark hair and her mother's gray-green eyes and none of her mother's restraint, and her stated opinions on life included that purple was the only acceptable color for cups, that dogs should be allowed on all furniture without exception, and that people who put their socks in the laundry inside out were doing it on purpose to be difficult. She regarded me for the first 2 weeks with the measured suspicion of a diplomat evaluating a new treaty partner. Then, on a Thursday evening in week 3, she walked into the living room while I was reading, sat down uninvited at the other end of the couch and said without preamble, "Do you know about narwhals?" "Yes," I said. She processed this. "Do you think they're real?" "Definitely real. I can show you a documentary." She turned to face me fully as though this had unlocked a classification system. "My friend Ellie says they're made up. Like Santa." "Your friend Ellie," I said carefully, "is going to have a difficult year." Vivi laughed. the completely unguarded laugh of a 6-year-old who has encountered something unexpectedly funny, and from that evening forward I was, apparently, a person she was willing to know. We watched the BBC Narwhal documentary together, Volume 2 loud, Vivi eating crackers from the box and periodically correcting the narrator with facts she had received from an uncertain source. Diana came home to find us on the living room floor 40 minutes into Sea Mammals, and stood in the doorway for a moment I caught only in my peripheral vision. The way she stilled. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter. She went to change her shoes and came back with a glass of wine and sat in the armchair and watched the rest of the documentary without saying anything, and we stayed like that, the three of us, until Vivi fell asleep against my shoulder. None of us mentioned it later. But something had tilted slightly. I noted it the way you note a shift in weather, not alarm, just awareness. Month 3. Her company hosted a charity gala, the kind that serves as a business dinner wearing a tuxedo, and we attended as a couple, which was theoretically the entire point but in practice required coordination we hadn't rehearsed. She wore dark green, simple, and arrived at the car already assembled, and I'd seen her in boardroom mode and in 6 a.m. sweatshirt mode, but this was a third version I hadn't accounted for. She was not performing. She was simply herself in a room full of people she'd chosen, and around them she was different, less managed, earlier to laugh, her hands moving when she talked. I watched her work the room and told myself the word I was looking for was admiration. That was the accurate category. We ended up at the bar around 9, and she tilted her glass toward a cluster of executives across the floor. The man in the blue tie has been trying to look like he isn't watching me for 40 minutes. He wants to acquire my northern distribution partner. I noticed, I said. He's not subtle. No. Pause. You are though. I looked at her. Subtle? You notice everything. You just don't announce it. She wasn't accusing me. Just observing. I've been trying to determine if it's a strategy or a personality trait. Both, I said. They got confused. She smiled at that, the real one which didn't wait for permission, and started to say something else, but the man in the blue tie had navigated across the room and was approaching. Diana's posture shifted. Not badly, just fractionally, the slight recalibration of someone putting on a professional layer they'd briefly set down. She leaned a half-inch toward me. I wasn't sure she knew she'd done it. I turned just enough so that the geometry of our stance made the situation clear. The man registered it, found a different trajectory and moved away. Diana didn't look at me. Thank you. I didn't do anything. I know, she said. That landed. In the specific way that simple, honest sentences do, when what they contain is larger than the words. Month 4. Kitchen. Past midnight. I couldn't sleep, I rarely could, and came downstairs to find Diana already at the kitchen table with her laptop open and the particular stillness of someone who had been sitting long enough to stop seeing the screen. You should sleep, I said. Noted, she said without looking up. You also should sleep. I don't sleep well. Neither do I. She looked up then. The kitchen was dim, just the counter light we kept on at night, and in it she looked less like the woman who ran a company and more like the woman who was tired of running one, which I suspected was the more accurate version. Is this the part where we bond over insomnia? It can be, I said. Or I make tea and ignore you professionally. Do both. Start with the tea. I made 2 cups. Set hers in front of her without asking. She wrapped both hands around it. Always she held things like warmth was something worth holding on to, and looked at me over the rim. Paul. Diana. Why did you say yes to this? When Patrick called. She set the cup down. You could have said no. I sat down across from her. Considered the honest answer, which had several layers I hadn't sorted through yet. Patrick said you needed someone sensible, I said. I thought I could manage sensible. That's not an answer. It's the one I have right now. She held my gaze for a moment, not pressing, just looking with those 2 sharp eyes that read more than they were handed. Then she said, I said yes because I thought you'd be easy to be around. And you are, she said. Which is more complicated than I expected it to be. The tea sat between us. Outside it had started to rain, not heavily, just the quiet, persistent kind that doesn't announce anything. I said, what's complicated about easy? She smiled, the complicated kind. Good night, Paul. Good night, Diana. I sat there for another 20 minutes after she left. Not because I was thinking about her. Fine. Because I was thinking about her. Month 5. A Saturday. She'd been in back-to-back calls since 7 that morning. Vivi was at her grandmother's. I had done 3 loads of laundry, reorganized the spice cabinet, not because I'm particular about spice cabinets, but because her system was organized alphabetically, which is the system of someone who does not cook, and started dinner around 5 because she hadn't eaten since morning and someone had to keep track of that. She came out of her office at 6:45, looked at the state of the kitchen and stopped. "You cooked," she said. "Someone had to." She looked at the table, which I had set, which I didn't usually bother with, and then at me, with the expression of a person encountering something that shouldn't be as significant as it feels. "Paul? It's pasta," I said. Not a declaration of anything. "Sit down." She sat. We ate. We talked for 2 hours about nothing particularly important. She had strong opinions about the Italian government, and a working theory that the best way to measure a city's quality of life was the cleanliness of its public libraries, and it was the first evening in months where neither of us was performing anything for anyone. At some point, without segue, she said, "I think I would have liked you in a different version of this." My fork went still. "What version is this?" "The contract version." She looked at her wine. "Which is what it is." "Right," I said. "Which is what it is." The phrase went flat in the space between us. Neither of us addressed the specific way it had done that. Month 6. The hallway. 2 in the morning. Vivi had a nightmare and came looking for Diana, and Diana had settled her back to sleep and come out to find me sitting in the hallway with my back against the wall, because I'd heard the small panicked footsteps and had been ready to go and had not been needed. Diana looked at me sitting on the floor in the dark. "She's okay," she said. "I know." She sat down next to me. On the floor, in the hallway, close enough that her shoulder was against mine, and we sat in the dark for a while without speaking, which was not uncomfortable in any way I could name. "She asked me," Diana said quietly, "if you were going to stay." I went very still. "What did you say?" I said I hoped so. She was looking at the far wall. Which was honest at least. That hit harder than anything I'd expected in a hallway at 2 in the morning. I had the sentence in my chest. The real one, the one that meant what it meant, and I was finding the nerve to let it out when my phone buzzed on the floor beside me. I looked at it reflexively. Call me, it's the Harwick contract. 2 a.m. Work? Diana said. Kyle, I said, and her face performed a complete character assessment in under a second. She stood. The moment dissolved. I sat on the floor of the hallway with an unfinished sentence and the particular weight of a thing almost said, listening to her quiet footsteps move away down the hall. Month 7. The Sunday. There was an afternoon in November, gray still, the kind where the light never quite arrives. When Diana was reading on the couch, Vivi was drawing at the coffee table, and I was doing something on my laptop that I had entirely stopped thinking about. I looked up at some point and simply noticed, this is ordinary. The 3 of us in a room on a Sunday, nobody performing anything, nobody managing anything, just the specific texture of a life being lived without commentary. I looked at Diana longer than I should have. She was reading a board report with the little furrow between her brows that meant she was disagreeing with it. She had stolen Vivi's purple blanket. Her feet were tucked under her. She was not, in that moment, the CEO of anything. She looked up and caught me looking. I moved my eyes back to my laptop. Paul. You've been reading the same page for 14 minutes. I'm a thorough reader. That document is a shipping manifest. I looked at it. She was right. I'd pulled up work by accident and had not processed a single line of it. A very thorough reader, I said. Vivi had fallen asleep on the floor, entirely typical. She treated all horizontal surfaces as nap opportunities, and the room had the specific quiet that makes honesty feel possible. Diana said, "What are you thinking?" I considered the honest answer. That this is good, I said. Which was true. Which was also half the truth. She looked at me. The gray-green eyes, sharp as always, reading something in my face that I wasn't handing over directly. Paul. Diana. You can say the rest of it. My chest tightened in a way I refused to name. I don't think I should, I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she reached over and straightened a book on the side table that didn't need straightening. Okay, she said. She picked up her board report. I stared at my shipping manifest. Vivi slept on, unconcerned. Correctly. Month 7. 1 week before Dominic arrived. We were in the kitchen after dinner, Vivi asleep, dishes done, the particular quiet of a house at 9 p.m., and Diana had her laptop open but wasn't typing. She was doing the thing she did when something was composing itself in her head. "The contract term is 8 months, she said. "I'm aware." I was washing a glass that was already clean. I noted this about myself. "Which means in 3 weeks, the board requirement is technically satisfied." She looked at me. Direct because she was always direct. "We should talk about what happens after." The glass sat on the counter. The kitchen light was warm. Outside the window, the season's first real snow had begun. Slow, deliberate, committed, the kind that means it. I looked at her. I thought about the hallway and the manifesto I'd never said, and the word after and everything it contained. "What do you want to happen after?" I said. She opened her mouth. Her phone lit up on the counter. She looked at it. Something moved across her face, tight, involuntary, something I hadn't seen before. "Who is it?" I said. "No one," she said. "It's nothing." She picked it up and left the kitchen. The snow continued outside the window. And the thing we'd almost said remained exactly that. 2 days later I found out it was Dominic. I volunteered for the Lyon project on a Monday. It was a legitimate assignment, a 6-week logistics audit for a company Callaway was acquiring in France, and I'd declined it twice because of timing. The timing on Monday felt suddenly convenient. I told myself I was being practical. The contract was satisfied. Dominic Hale was back. Dominic, who ran an international investment firm, who was polished and appropriate and had, presumably, none of the specific quiet strangeness of a man who reorganized spice cabinets and listened to cartography podcasts. I told myself that stepping back was the dignified option. I was being a coward. I had convinced myself it was grace. I told Diana on a Tuesday evening while Vivi was watching something with too many bright colors in the other room. I said it efficiently, "Lyon 6 weeks HR confirmed." Diana went very still. "When?" she said. "Friday." She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I had to keep myself from looking away. "Is this about Dominic?" "It's about Lyon," I said. "It's a work assignment." She nodded once, slowly in the way she nodded when she decided arguing wasn't worth the energy. "Okay," she said. That was all. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about okay and everything it wasn't saying, and at some point, around midnight I became aware of her in the hallway, not footsteps, just the sense of her presence, which I had apparently been calibrated to, and then nothing. I was at the kitchen table at 5 the next morning, packed bag by the door when she came in. Not in work clothes. In the old sweatshirt she wore when she wasn't dressing for anything, and she had the expression she'd had in the hallway with Vivi, open, unmanaged, not performing anything for anyone. She sat down across from me without saying a word. I looked at her. She looked at me. "Paul," she said. "I need you to know something before you go." "Diana. Please." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I know what the contract says. I know what the terms are. But when Vivi asked if you were staying," she stopped. Looked at her hands. "I didn't say I hope so because it was the honest thing to say at 2 in the morning. I said it because it's been true since month 2. Maybe month 1. The kitchen was silent. It was still dark outside. The coffee hadn't even finished brewing. "She's not the only one," Diana said, "who needs the answer to that question." I looked at her for a long moment. At the 2 sharp eyes, tired and unguarded. At the hands flat on the table, not hiding anything. I got up. I crossed the kitchen. I sat in the chair beside her, not across from her, beside her, and said, "I'm going to Lyon for 6 weeks." She started to pull back. And then, I said, "I'm coming home." She went very still. I said nothing else because nothing else was needed. From across the house, Vivi's voice arrived, clear and urgent. "Is there waffles?" I laughed, genuinely, fully, and Diana pressed her fingers over her mouth and laughed too, and that was how it happened. Not a scene. Not a speech. Just a Tuesday morning and 6-year-old's breakfast priorities cutting through everything with absolute precision. I made waffles. We all ate together. I left for the airport at noon. I arrived in Lyon on a Friday afternoon. The audit firm's office was in the 3rd arrondissement, a 10-minute walk from the apartment I'd rented. Small, bright, smelling of old building and good coffee, with a window that looked onto a narrow street where someone had left a bicycle locked to a lamppost for what appeared to be several weeks. I called Diana from that window the first night, just to confirm arrival. We talked for 40 minutes about things we hadn't talked about enough before. What Vivi was covering in school, a development with the northern distributor, a documentary about Portuguese fishing villages she was halfway through. When we said goodnight, it had weight in it, the specific gravity of a thing understood without being stated. I stayed at the window for a while after. I called every night. On the 11th day she didn't answer. Not once. 2 days of missed calls, and then Celia, her assistant, sent a message that said only, "Diana is traveling." I assumed work. I sent a text. Received back, "I'll explain when I see you." What I did not expect was to look up from my desk on a Wednesday morning and see her walking through the glass door of the Lyon office in a coat I hadn't seen before, with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and gotten on a plane. The entire audit team went very quiet. I stood up. She looked at me across the open plan office. "Can we talk?" "Sure," I said, because apparently, I had reverted to monosyllabic at the sight of her. We found a conference room. Mismatched chairs. View of a gray courtyard. The ambient sound of an office building going about its business, indifferent to whatever was happening in this particular room. She sat. I sat. She set her bag down and looked at her hands for a moment in the way that meant something significant was assembling itself. "I'm pregnant," she said. The room was quiet. 9 weeks. I found out 10 days ago. She kept her eyes on the table, then lifted them. "I needed to tell you in person. Because you deserve to hear it from me directly. Not a text. Not a phone call." She paused. "And because I needed to see your face when I told you." I sat with it, not stunned exactly, but adjusting the shape of the future in real time and finding with some surprise that it fit better than the previous version had. "Is it?" I started. "Yes," she said, and the word carried a particular firmness. "Of course it's yours, Paul. We've been..." She made a gesture that was half exasperation and half something considerably fonder. "Yes." I nodded. Looked at the table. Looked back at her. "Are you okay? Medically? How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "And I've had to give up medium roast coffee for 3 weeks, which is frankly the more upsetting development." Something in my chest eased entirely. "Diana," I said. "Paul. I was coming back. You know that." "I know," she said. "I'm not very good at waiting. Aunt Vivi has been asking about you every single day, which has not helped my ability to be rational about anything." She looked at me. "What did you tell her? Before you left?" "That I'd bring her a postcard of a lion because she got Lyon confused with." "She has been checking the mail every day." Diana pressed her lips together, not quite managing to hold the smile back. "Every morning. In her pajamas." I had ordered the postcard from a shop near my apartment on day 3 of the trip. It was already in my bag ready to mail. I had not mentioned this to anyone. I stood up. Diana stood up. In the small ordinary conference room in Lyon, mismatched chairs, gray courtyard, the hum of an unremarkable Wednesday, I took 1 step forward and she took 1 step forward, and we met in the middle. Not a dramatic arrival. Not a cinematic reunion. 2 people in the same room finally with nowhere else to be. She said into my shoulder, "You reorganized my spice cabinet. Your system had no internal logic." "Alphabetical is a logic, Paul." "Alphabetical," I said, "is the logic of someone who does not cook." She laughed, fully the real one, and I held on. We flew home 4 days later. Together. I mailed the postcard from the airport. It arrived the day before we did. Vivi had it taped to her wall by the time we walked through the door. 1 year later. Vivi started 2nd grade in September and reported on the first day that her teacher had a very reasonable system for cubbies, which suggested she'd been listening to more adult conversation than any of us had realized. I picked her up from school twice a week when Diana had late meetings, and on those afternoons we had a ritual. Stop at the bakery on Millcroft, get 1 thing each, argue about whose thing was better all the way home. I always lost. She had extremely specific criteria and was not open to negotiation. 18 months later. The baby arrived in June, a boy which no one had expected Diana to take as personally as she did, and they named him James after her father. He slept terribly and ate constantly and was, according to Vivi's formal assessment, not quite as interesting as expected but improving. I sat in the hospital at 4 in the morning with James asleep on my chest and Diana asleep in the bed beside me and the monitors doing their quiet work, and I thought, I have not spent a single day of this arrangement thinking of it as an arrangement. I just lived in it. I'd been living in it since month 1 probably and had simply been the last to say so. Not late. Just careful. 2.5 years later. I proposed in the kitchen. Because of course I did. It was a Sunday, unhurried, no obligations. Vivi was at a friend's house. James was asleep in the other room. Diana was at the counter with her back to me, reading something on her tablet and eating crackers directly from the box, which she still did despite years of me noting that we owned plates. I said her name. She turned around. I was already down on one knee, which, on the tile floor with my 36-year-old joints, was a commitment in itself. The ring was simple. I had chosen it with more care than I'd applied to anything else in recent memory, a clean setting with a gray-green stone that was the most specific color I had ever made a decision about. Diana Chin, I said. I don't want a contract. I want the rest of it, with you, in this kitchen on this floor which is very cold on my knee. The whole thing. All of it. She looked at the ring for a moment. Then she said, you reorganized my spice cabinet before you even liked me. I liked you, I said. I just hadn't admitted it yet. She came down to the floor. Both knees right there on the tile, crackers still in hand, and she held my face in both of her palms and said, yes. Obviously yes, Paul. Now please get up, you're going to hurt yourself. We stayed on the kitchen floor for another 20 minutes. James eventually made himself audible from down the hall. Neither of us moved immediately. When people ask how we met, Diana says, he was going to let me lose a boardroom argument to some man's ego. And I say, she wrote patience to herself in the margin of a notepad and I thought, that's a person who knows exactly what she's doing. Neither version is complete. Both are true. What would you have done if you married someone for a contract, and discovered, 3 months in, that you'd accidentally chosen them for real? And have you ever had a love that arrived quietly without announcing itself, until one day you looked up and realized it had been there all along? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.